This isn't a normal season for Liverpool Football Club, because although they currently sit in the Champions League spaces, they're actually closer to Leeds in 16th than they are to Arsenal at the top of the table. And there's actually a very real possibility that they drop out of the top 5 altogether. In part, this is because despite their massive expenditure in the summer, there's still holes in the squad. And those holes are only going to get bigger going forward. And so rather than treating this January as the opportunity to make finishing touches to their squad, like many other top sides do, they should use this as a chance to review what went wrong last summer and get ahead of some of the problems in their squad in a sensible way. That's right, this is Sensible Transfers, where we look for weaknesses in squads and identify solutions to those problems. Remember, this is not what we think the clubs will do, it's what we think they should do. And with that in mind, let's begin with an overview of where this Liverpool squad are at right now. Because I think if you look at the squad on the board here, it's very visually obvious that there's holes all over the place. Because if we look at the fullbacks, these are areas where Liverpool spent a lot of money strengthening in the summer, and already it looks as though they're lacking depth here. And then there's a striker area, and Liverpool signed 2 of the best strikers in the league, which means they do have depth there, but Isak got injured, and now the question is, who is going to back up Ekitike? There is Chiesa, but he's not really found favour with Slot and has been shown up to be a little bit physically lacking in the league. So again, questions of depth there. And then there's the midfield area, and while it looks like there's a lot of players here, many of these players have very similar physical or technical profiles, and so there's a question about whether or not they could maybe have a bit more tactical diversity in this part of the squad. But none of these areas feel particularly pressing, and so don't expect Liverpool to make any signings here unless any market opportunities arise. But there are 2 areas that, in my opinion, are immediate concerns that need to be addressed in this window. The first one is the centre-back area. Because Virgil van Dijk is 34 years old and rapidly heading towards retirement, Ibrahima Konaté's contract runs out in the summer, and he's not shown any signs of signing a new one. And behind those 2 starting players, you've got Joe Gomez, who is a utility guy who's used across the back line and isn't getting any younger himself, and Giovanni Leone, who is a nice prospect but has spent the whole season out with an ACL injury. So 2 starting level players who could be leaving in the summer and very little backup to speak of. The other area that Liverpool should address is the wide forward area, because if we look at this graphic, we can see that the 2 most productive players for Liverpool last season were Mohamed Salah and Luis Diaz. And as we know, Mohamed Salah has had his problems this season, eventually getting dropped because of his performances and then falling out with Arne Slot. And he's also approaching the end of his career, and so a replacement is very much needed. And then on the other side of the pitch, Luis Diaz has moved to Bayern Munich. Cody Gakpo hasn't quite reached the same level of productivity on that side, and so Liverpool have had a real problem with goal scoring in those wide areas. Now, it is worth saying that Florian Wirtz can also be played off the left, and they do have Rio Ngamoa, who is an up-and-coming star. And so the more pressing issue is Mohamed Salah. How are you going to replace him? How are you going to get more goals and productivity through this right-hand side? It's also worth mentioning the elephant in the room here, and that is that Arne Slot has had a very difficult season, and however unlikely it might look like now, could be the case that by the time the summer comes around, he isn't the manager of Liverpool anymore. And even if he is still around, he might take a very different tactical approach to the one that's faltered so badly this season. And so any business done in January has to be a little bit more generic, bringing in players who could work in any potential system, not just the current one. So let's start at centre-back, because this is the position of greatest need. Now, the most immediate solution to this problem is to bring in a starting level player in January who can operate on either side of the pitch, because this gives Liverpool a huge amount of flexibility heading into the summer. And the best example here is a player that Liverpool nearly signed at the end of last summer, and that is Marc Guéhi from Crystal Palace. Guéhi is one of the best options in the centre-back market right now who isn't at a top club, and he has a really attractive profile in the modern game. Not only is he incredibly well-rounded as a player, offering quality on both sides of the ball, he's also two-footed enough to play on either side of the pitch, giving Liverpool a degree of flexibility. In the immediate term, this would give them the option of playing Guéhi on the left if Van Dijk is unavailable, or playing him on the right if Konaté should continue to struggle with form. And then when the summer arrives, Liverpool's recruitment team can then reassess things. If Konaté doesn't sign his contract and leaves, they can decide whether or not they're happy enough with Guéhi's performances on the right to keep him there long term, and then they can focus on looking for a Van Dijk replacement over the next few seasons. But if Konaté stays, then they can use Guéhi as the Van Dijk replacement and then focus on bringing in a young backup behind him on the left. However, given that a Guéhi deal this January is fraught with difficulty, perhaps Liverpool should shift their recruitment efforts at centre-back to the summer window, where they work on either keeping Van Dijk or Konaté and then bring bringing in a replacement on the other side of the partnership. And given the fact that Van Dijk is approaching retirement, the focus should be on trying to keep Konate because he's at peak age. In which case, my recommendation is that Liverpool look for a player who can best reproduce Van Dijk's skill set. Of course, Van Dijk has a very well-rounded profile, but I want to focus on his ball progression because he's one of the few players in Liverpool's back line who can consistently move the ball down the field. Now, if we compare centre-backs across Europe's top 5 leagues last season against progressive metrics, we can see that some of the better centre-back options in the world are at the top end here. And amongst these best options, some of them are a little bit too old, like Inigo Martinez or Daley Blind, or they're already established at an elite club and it'll be hard for them to be tempted away. But let me tell you, there is a player who shows up here who has appeared in my sensible transfer videos before, and that is Nico Schlotterbeck at Borussia Dortmund. Now, Schlotterbeck's contract runs out in 2027, which means Dortmund should be open to selling him this summer. And not only would Schlotterbeck more than replace Van Dijk's progressive ability, he would also bring a level of proactivity to the centre-back role that would allow Konate to take a more reactive approach, which better suits his skill set. But even in a situation where Van Dijk stays and it's Konate who leaves, Liverpool should still be focusing on ball progression, in my opinion, because Liverpool still has to plan for the eventuality that Van Dijk is going to leave in the next few seasons. And so to get ahead of this, I would consider another one of these players who shows up really well in the progressive metrics, but who plays on the other side of the pitch, and that is Jan-Paul van Hecke, who plays for Brighton. Now, Van Hecke is in a similar position to Schlotterbeck because he's an elite ball progressor who has experience at the highest level, and he's also heading into the final year of his contract next year. And so, as he approaches prime age, he should be looking for a step up to the elite level, although Brighton will make sure that they negotiate a good fee. But regardless of what decisions Liverpool make about next summer, they still have a depth problem at centre-back right now, with only Joe Gomez and the injured Leone as their options. This means they would be wise to keep their eye open for market opportunities this window to make their task easier going forward. A player they've been linked with this window who fits this profile is Joel Ordóñez of Club Brugge. Ordóñez is a 21-year-old prospect who's been impressing in the Belgian league this season and who's reported to be available for around £35 million. But as a right-sided option, he probably overlaps too much with Leone, and so perhaps a better option would be Jarek Gaserowski of PSV. He's been a consistent starter for PSV at left centre-back this season, picking up nearly 2,000 minutes in the league. And under Peter Bosz, PSV currently enjoy the highest levels of possession in the Eredivisie, which means stylistically, Gaserowski is playing the kind of football that Liverpool will expect their centre-backs to be playing. Bringing him in January would immediately fix the depth issues that Liverpool have, and if Van Dijk decides to stay on for further seasons, it will give Liverpool more time to assess Gaserowski to see if he could be an eventual replacement. And so let's turn to the other issue here of how Liverpool can try to replace Mohamed Salah. There are lots of different profiles of wingers, but if Liverpool are looking for a like-for-like Salah replacement, then we're essentially talking about a goal-scoring winger from the right. The best and most obvious candidate in this profile is Real Madrid's Rodrigo. Not only has he proven himself to be a goal scorer from the right in one of the best teams in the world, he's also out of his contract in 2028, which would make him gettable, and he's been reported by the Spanish media to be open to a move away. The other notable option here is Bradley Barcola from PSG, who's in the same contract situation as Rodrigo, and he was reportedly linked with a number of Premier League clubs in the summer. The only problem here is that both Barcola and Rodrigo prefer playing off the left, and Liverpool might be reluctant to pay a big fee for a player on the basis of quality over fit, having taken the same approach last summer and struggling this season. It's also worth mentioning that in many respects, Florian Wirtz was the Mohamed Salah replacement in terms of a focal point that they could build their team around. In which case, Liverpool might be willing to settle for a right winger in the tier below, someone they could even bring in this January. There are some nice options here too, even with Antoine Semenyo heading to Manchester City, as this move might actually open up a pathway for Savinho to leave in January, although he is currently injured, has a long contract and has tended to produce best from the left. Jarrod Bowen is another intriguing prospect and could be gettable, especially if West Ham go down this season. Bowen could be the perfect Salah replacement, but for one thing. At 29 years old, signing him would just be delaying the problem and Liverpool would very soon be looking for a new replacement. At the other end of the age spectrum, Liverpool could consider Yankuba Minteh of Brighton, who Arne Slot worked with when he was at Feyenoord. Now, Minteh is probably stretching the definition of a goal-scoring winger at this point, but at only 21 years old, there would be the hope that he could develop into that kind of profile given time. And given that most of his problems in front of goal seem to be rooted in decision-making, there's certainly scope for this evolution to take place. However, his contract runs to 2029, and so it's likely Liverpool would have to pay a very high fee, and so perhaps the better option here is for them to find a more ready-to-run option from outside the Premier League. Which is why my pick for sensible transfer here is Christian Pulisic. Currently putting up an impressive 97th percentile goal-scoring season at AC Milan, Pulisic's contract also runs out in 2027, which would make him eminently gettable, and potentially cheap enough to overlook the biggest downside here. that by the beginning of next season, he'll have just turned 28. But if Liverpool could get 3 years out of him, he would be the perfect Salah replacement. And if you want some proof, Liverpool fans might remember this Salah-esque goal that he scored against them last season in the Champions League. And so here you can see him receiving the ball in behind in the wide channel, carrying the ball into the penalty area, holding off pressure to coolly slot it past the goalkeeper. So these are my sensible transfer picks, and this is what Liverpool would look like after the January transfer window if I was in charge. We've obviously got Gasarovski as a backup to Van Dijk, and also Pulisic and Salah sharing a role here. JJ is up next with his sensible picks for Real Madrid, but if you can't wait until then for your transfer fix, why not check out The Athletic's deal sheet on the website, or tune into our transfer shows every other Saturday in January. Bye! If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football